Jack, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Jack Dytham, a final year single honours history student, and I've just handed in my dissertation on kingship in 8th century Mercia.
And I'm Catherine Sykes. I'm a lecturer in early medieval history at the University of Birmingham, and I was Jack's dissertation supervisor. Um, so to get us started, Jack, would you mind telling us a little bit about 8th century Mercia? What
Yeah,
interested you
so
about it?
it's a kind of a period about 716, 8 to 825 is kind of seen as a high point in kind of power and maybe kind of geographical extent of kings of Mercia's rule. So they kind of start out as kings ruling around kind of Lichfield, Tamworth, kind of the northernish area of the Midlands around the Trent. And then they kind of expand their authority into an area that kind of roughly bounds Wales, the Humber, East Anglia, and kind of the Thames in the south. And then they kind of exert loose-ish overlordship, I guess, over other kings and kingdoms with varying permanence and kind of come under challenge at certain points. And so my project was looking to kind of re-examine the way that Mercia has already been studied, because there is quite a noticeable lack of source material in Mercia, which just means historians have quite often examined Mercia and its kings from the standpoint of either Wessex to the south, and usually from Alfred's Wessex, so best part of a century after kind of the period I'm looking at, or kind of using the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, or from the continent and the Carolingians. And I guess a big problem that I found with that is that they're both kind of seen as pinnacles of early medieval government. And they've kind of been ascribed these kind of state-like institutional characters, which means Mercia, kind of in part owing to a lack of source material. Its kings have been seen either as the failed origins of an England that Alfred supposedly went on to lay the foundations for, kind of being predestined to be overtaken or absorbed into Wessex, or completely seen as primitive. And I guess some recent work by George Molyneux has kind of repositioned Alfred and kind of taken him out of that maybe foundational role, or kind of limited his influence in that somewhat, and kind of actually insisted that the main development in Anglo-Saxon governmental history occurred actually in the late 10th century with King Edgar. And so my kind of emphasis was, if the position of Alfred and Wessex in Anglo-Saxon governmental history has been fundamentally kind of altered and reduced, then, and if Alfred was not in fact so different to his predecessors, then these Mercian kings and their kind of method of kingship ought to be reassessed too.
Thank you. So as you said, there's not tons of textual material. Mercia famously doesn't, is a bit of a lacuna in lots of the sources. So what sort of things did you look at to enable you to do this?
Yeah, so the narrative sources kind of in the kind of early Anglo-Saxon period go almost completely either side of Mercia. In the 7th century, you have Bede as a narrative source for Northumbria, and he's pretty uninterested in Mercia. And then, like I've already mentioned, for Wessex in the 9th century, you've got the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and that goes forward, obviously. And so it leaves charter and hagiographies almost kind of non-existent for Mercia, or very fleeting. And where the charters do survive, they're from kind of Canterbury and Worcester, which are areas that do come under Mercian control at varying points and to varying extents. But they kind of are mainly informative of how Mercian kingship worked in those areas specifically, and they're not necessarily indicative of the way Mercian kings were governing in the heartland. And so a lot of archaeological and material evidence can kind of help build up a better picture of what's going on in Mercia itself, and also rebalance the picture in those sorts of regions where there are charters, and take it away from a purely textual and kind of charter-based history. And so a lot of coinage underwent a lot of major changes during the 8th century. Increased involvement of kings has been identified by a lot of historians in the minting process, and kings begin to be acknowledged on the coins themselves. which speaks a lot to kind of new ideas about royal prerogative and kind of the authority of kings to get involved in a process where they've not got a monopoly on minting coins, but clearly they're able to exercise a lot of influence and control and outmaneuver other interested parties in minting. And things like earthworks such as Offa's Dyke, for like kind of fortifications, archaeological finds of those. They kind of show Mercian kings as able to organize and access and gain access to resources fiscally, militarily, and together with their charters and coins kind of show them to maybe have begun to have a more expansive vision of their place as kings, getting involved in more avenues for resource, in more ways to control and assert their authority. And I think it's only with those material pieces of evidence that you can get that picture for Mercia with the lack of written sources.
And you've been talking, so the focus of the kind of project was largely on kingship, but what did you find out about queenship and kind of the position of women within the royal household?
I think certainly one avenue that I looked at was in terms of marriages, and whether royal marriages were indicative of alliances being formed, kind of with other kingdoms, be they other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, or at one point Offa is trying to negotiate with Charlemagne on the continent over a marriage of one of his daughters. And I think it shows that women clearly weren't involved in power politics. And I think whilst kind of maybe in terms of marriage, it kind of is easy to get a picture that women were pawns in kind of male power plays with other rulers. I think when I looked at how women were holding land with religious houses, and I think that shows that controlling those lands and keeping those lands required women to maneuver in ways where, okay, their power might have been interrelated or dependent on the authority of a king or a male relative. It showed that from the king's perspective, that women were kind of firmly knitted into an ability to maintain and hold land, because there seems to be a quite strong connection between women of a certain dynasty holding these religious houses, whilst their male kin are on the throne or strong landholders. And when their kind of position falters on the throne, women seem to falter and lose their authority in these religious houses too. And I think clearly there is a strong connection that can't be ignored there.
And obviously you've just come to the kind of end of the dissertation process, but you were before we started to kind of record, we were just talking about how you were a bit sad about the end of your dissertation process. So what next? Let's look at more Mercian
so
things.
I think my research project, I chose quite an isolated period between 716 and 825, which has become quite a traditional start and end date for this idea of a Mercian supremacy, of their dominant position in Anglo-Saxon England. And I think debate has certainly extended backwards from that date over to what sort of powers the 7th century Mercian kings wielded, and how less formal it may have been compared to the 8th century Mercian kings. But I think work by certain historians has kind of emphasized the importance of Mercia after 825, so the other end of the kind of date range. And it's looked mainly to kind of unpick the narratives around Wessex and the formation of England and how it was an entirely West Saxon project. And so with the kind of increased recognition of how Mercia played a role and was an integral part in creating England in the late 9th and into the 10th century, I think extending a examination of Mercian kingship from the kind of 8th century through the 9th century and looking at it alongside the development of West Saxon kingship at the same time, I think is it kind of would allow you to see how Mercian kingship evolved, and how the legacies of Ethelbald, Offa, Cenwulf, these 8th century Mercian kings, whether they kind of lasted into the 9th century, and how Mercian kingship evolved in new circumstances when their dominance may not have guaranteed them a, their authority and power may not have guaranteed them a preeminent position in Anglo-Saxon England. And I think it would also further an understanding of the work that historians have done to kind of re-understand Alfred and how he may stand up to his contemporaries if you extend this study of Mercian kingship through to his reign as well.
Yeah, and potentially beyond. So kind of looking at the Earls of Mercia and kind of thinking about changing continuity and political structures there might be depending on how far you want to kind of keep going.
Oh, absolutely. I think it kind of definitely that furthers it. It's not just a kind of how Mercian kings reposition themselves when their dominance is no longer guaranteed, but how rulers of Mercia reposition and are able to exert authority when their very position as kings comes under challenge. I think speaks to kind of the importance not just of looking at titles, but of kind of de facto power as well, and how the two are, they might be interrelated, but that certainly kind of the legacy of Mercian kingship certainly isn't just extinguished when Mercian rulers become ealdormen under Wessex.
Yes. I think one of the bits of your project that I found particularly interesting is, as you mentioned at the beginning, there's been a big reevaluation of sort of political structures, particularly these sort of narratives about the origins of England, and particularly the work of George Molyneux. And you've also kind of done quite a lot on Rory Naismith's work on coinage and kind of rethinking about that. But from my own perspective, this sort of rethinking the royal household, the nature of the Mercian household, the place of women within those kind of political networks is really interesting as well. And again, builds on work of Pauline Stafford and others, but plenty of other stuff to be said about that material.
Yeah, precisely. I think a big backbone of my kind of project was not necessarily examining an area that was new, but was kind of challenging ways that Mercia had already been studied. And I think a lot of that comes from the kind of maybe limited evidence base. It's not an area where there's loads and loads of evidence coming out all the time that was going to fundamentally change the picture. But I think it was definitely more of a conceptual kind of challenge to the way these sorts of histories have been approached. Like you said, maybe a lack of recognition of the place of women, or the kind of maybe teleological understandings of the state and things, for sure. Yeah.
Well, it's great. It's been great talking to you, Jack.
Right.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you.